Welcome to Worchester Street. I hope you enjoy your stay. These 4 tales tell the allegedly true stories of several people who ventured into the woods and had experiences with creatures that were both strange and hostile. There are over 190 million acres of forest in the US alone. That's almost a third of the country. If you were to search a section of forest that was 5 miles wide and 5 miles long every single day, it'd take you almost 1,000 years to have walked through it all. It makes you wonder what creatures still might exist, lurking deep in the woods and preying on those who venture out into their territory. Story number 1. We saw a creature near the border and have the pictures to prove it.
If you've ever seen a picture of the border between the US and Canada, you know that there's a 20-foot gap between trees that goes all along the 49th parallel from the Pacific Ocean until the Atlantic. I'm showing a picture of it here. I'm a border patrol agent. My job is to ride along sections of the border, cutting down any saplings that are starting to grow in that gap, and to look for any illegal activity that might be happening as well. Last week, I went on a 3-day excursion along a 400-mile section of the border. 3 of us set out on snowmobiles. Myself, an older guy named Brent, and a new hire named John. We carried extra gas, camping supplies, and a satellite phone in case we found anything suspicious. The snow was deep, as I'm sure you can imagine. After a few hours, we were about as far from civilization as you can reasonably be in North America. We stopped every couple of 100 feet to cut down saplings that had been missed in previous excursions. We also made stops if any of us saw any suspicious tracks in the woods. Most everything you'd find this far out into the wilderness was either some very extreme hunters or drug cartels smuggling drugs to Canada. It was getting late on the first day of the trip. I was the lead snowmobile, carving back and forth in the fresh powder, when I saw a shape blocking the path. I pulled my machine off to the side, with Brent and John following my lead. The shape I'd seen was a dead moose that was laying on its side. There was some blood on the ground next to it, but not much. I took a picture of the moose, and I'll show it here. Be warned, it's pretty graphic. Brent walked up to the moose and leaned down next to it. He motioned for me to look. The moose's throat had been cut all the way down to the bone. Brent raised an eyebrow at me. "How do you figure that happened?" he asked. I told him I didn't know, but that I'd certainly never seen anything like it before. I looked the moose over and saw no other damage than that long, clean cut across its throat. John blew air into his hands to warm them. "Maybe it was a bear or wolf. They've got claws, right?" he said. Brent looked around at the snowy ground. "Does there look like there's enough blood here to you? Because it seems like there's only flecks here and there." He pointed to the head. "And next to the throat, there's almost no blood on the snow at all." I realized he was right. Not only that, but whatever had killed it hadn't taken any meat. Just blood, apparently. John looked at the 2 of us. "You guys ever hear of a blood-drinking animal out here before?" Brent pointed to the moose. "Yep, but I don't think a tick did that." We couldn't find any more clues, so we rode for a few more miles and made camp. I called up the base on our satellite phone and told them we may have found signs of hunters. They made a note, then told me that a storm was coming in and would be hitting later that next day. The night passed without any other incident, and the next morning we set off again. We found a bunch of trees and bushes in the morning, so we wasted a couple of hours hacking at them and cursing the earlier teams that could have dealt with them when they were smaller. We made good time in the afternoon. The border wound up to a rocky mountain where the trees don't grow, so we were allowed to take a detour around the southern base. I took some video of the trail, which you're seeing now. It was fresh powder, so I was having a bit of fun with it. In the video, I'm in front, with Brent and John following behind. Each of us was hauling a small trailer with our extra gas and supplies. As the day ended, the snow started falling heavily. We were eager to make camp and wait out the storm, so we were already looking for a place that might work when John signaled for us to stop. We pulled around, and he pointed to some tracks that had left the borderline and curved farther south into the woods. They were clearly human. We both looked at Brent. He shrugged. "I guess we need to check it out," he said. "If it's a person living out here, maybe we can sleep inside tonight. If it's drug runners, we'll be prepared." He pulled his rifle off of his machine. He pointed at John. "Why don't you keep an eye on our machines while we check this out? We'll radio you if it's anything good." We followed the trail on foot into the woods for around 20 minutes. Eventually the woods opened up to a clearing. A single-room cabin was visible through the falling snow, with its lights off inside. Brent told me to keep an eye out for extra footprints, and to circle around to meet up on the other side. When we met, neither of us had seen any extra prints. Brent slung his rifle. "This guy's probably just some hermit," he said. "If it was a cartel, we'd have seen more activity." I told him he was probably right, but that it was possible that the falling snow had covered up extra tracks. Brent gave the go-ahead to approach the door. The two of us made our way towards the house, and I yelled out, "Customs and Border Protection." There was no answer, and as we got closer I saw why. The front door was swinging open on its hinges inside the cabin. We climbed up the steps and flashed our lights inside. There was so much blood. Every surface inside the cabin was flecked with it, and there was a pool in the center of the room. There wasn't a body, just blood and the signs of a violent struggle. I walked up to the stove and held my hand next to it. It was still warm to the touch. Brent kicked a piece of cloth into the blood, and it came away wet when he tugged on it. "What happened here?" he asked. We turned back to the door. I knelt down and saw that something had cut away the wood where the door handle had been. It looked like a huge X-Acto knife had been taken to it. There were straight, deep lines crisscrossing all over it and a gaping hole where the handle had been. Brent swore under his breath as he took the door in. "Bear, maybe?" he asked. I asked him what kind of bear made such perfectly straight cuts. On top of that, what kind of bear knew to attack the handle of the door? We didn't have any answers, and both knew we had to get out of there. I had just gotten back to my feet when I heard it. This unnatural croaking sound echoed from the clearing outside. It sounded like somebody choking, but impossibly loud. "Did you hear that?" Brent asked. "That noise?" Me and Brent both pointed our guns at the door and waited, listening hard. The moment passed, and we didn't hear anything other than the wind and falling snow. I told Brent we had to make our way back. We left the cabin and started towards the north where we'd come from. Just before we entered the woods, I thought to take a picture of the cabin, so here that is. The walk back to our machines was tense, to say the least. We didn't hear any more croaking, and made the walk back in half the time. Finally, we got to where we'd left our snowmobiles and found them with John keeping watch. We hopped on our machines and drove for an hour or so. We wanted to be as far from that cabin as possible before we stopped for the night. We made camp and decided to set a watch rotation. I called base and reported what we'd seen in the cabin, and they said that they'd send a helicopter the next day with a team to investigate. I was glad for that. We were not detectives, and none of us had any experience investigating whatever this situation was. We set out early the next morning. I figured we'd make it to base late that night if we made good time. The ride was only occasionally broken up by stopping to cut trees. The mood was tense, and nobody said much during our lunch breaks or while we worked. Pretty soon the sun had dipped below the horizon, and we switched on the snowmobile headlights to see. All three of us wanted to get to a warm bed before the night was over. We were only a few hours away when we pulled off to cut down a few more trees that were creeping over the line. I chopped at the biggest one with the chainsaw I'd brought, while Brent and John were hacking at some of the smaller saplings with machetes. My tree had finally cracked and fallen when Brent called out. I walked over to where he was kneeling down in the snow. He nodded his head towards the ground. I bent over and took a look. It was a print in the snow. It looked like a human hand, but bigger. I noticed long, thin marks running from each finger, which reminded me of bear claws. I took a picture, which I'll show now. "That looks like a human hand, doesn't it?" Brent said. I told him that I thought it did, except for whatever those claw marks were. Then I heard it again, the impossibly loud croaking from the woods. "Guys," John shouted. He was pointing into the woods to our left. I followed his finger and saw a creature standing behind a tree about 100 feet away. It looked humanoid, but was on all fours with impossibly long arms and legs. It had white skin and fingers that each ended with a long claw. I saw its face. It was covered in dried blood, and eyes so red they almost shined in the darkness, and it was staring at us, croaking. I had my phone in my hand already, so I took a picture. I don't know why. I was operating on instinct, I guess. It was dark, so you won't be able to see much, but here it is. The creature started moving towards us, mostly on two legs, but using its hands sometimes too. We jumped on our snowmobiles and hit the gas before it got close. I rode faster than I'd ever gone before. None of us said a word. We just rode as hard as we could. The ride back to base took another 2 hours or so, but we didn't slow down until we made it to the station. I quit my job there soon after that. I don't know what they found when they went back to the cabin. It might be something worth looking into.
Story number 2. There's something unnatural in the Rocky Mountains.
We've gone to visit my wife Sarah's family every summer since we got married about 4 years ago. They live in a small town way up in the mountains. Her parents own a lot of land, so we would spend our time riding ATVs and hiking trails. Here's a picture I took a while back, just so you have some idea of what I'm talking about. A while back I took a week off work, and we drove up there to spend the time with her parents and siblings. It was a good time, and the week passed way too quick. Sunday rolled around, and we loaded up our old sedan for the drive home. We left her parents' place in the late afternoon, and had started winding our way down the mountain towards the highway, when Sarah sighed. "Great, check it out," she said. She handed me her phone. It showed that the highway was red with traffic for something like 25 miles. "Must be an accident," she said. "I guess we'll be sitting in traffic for a while." I pulled to the side of the road and pulled out my own phone. I saw that there was a long, winding road that cut through the mountains for nearly 50 miles, finally rejoining the highway after the traffic ended. I figured that going slow on an old windy road was better than sitting in stop-and-go traffic for 5 hours. Sarah was very against the decision. When I asked her why, she just told me that she had a bad feeling about it. Still, somehow I convinced her that we'd be fine. So instead of turning right and heading down towards the highway, we turned left and headed deeper into the mountains. The road turned to dirt pretty quick. Sarah jumped into the back seat so she could stretch out, and she recorded some of what we saw out the window, which is what you've been seeing up till now. I was shocked at how deserted it was. We only passed one house over the entire hour, and not a single car. We'd been on the road for a little over an hour when we came around a hill. Up ahead, there was a single crashed car just off the road. I pulled off to the side of the road, and got out to take a closer look. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but realized I had no signal, not even roaming. I took a picture, which you can see here. I came around to the driver's side of the car, and saw that the driver's window was shattered, with no sign of the driver anywhere. Sarah walked to the front of the car and put her hand on the hood. "The engine's cold," she said. "That means it's been at least a couple hours since the crash, right? Are we the first ones on this road to drive by?" I told her that I didn't know, but that it could be with how few people we'd seen. Sarah pointed to the broken glass from the window. "It seems like a lot of this glass is inside the car," she said. "If the driver busted it to get out, wouldn't it make sense that it'd be out on the ground beside the car?" She was right. The inside of the car was littered with the safety glass from the window. I looked closer and saw flecks of blood covering some surfaces too. Where's the driver, though? I didn't like that. I told Sarah it was time to go, and that we'd call somebody once we had cell signal. She agreed, and we hopped back in my car. I turned the key in my ignition and heard the rapid clicking noise that meant that my battery was dead. I popped my hood and saw that there was a bunch of corrosion built up on my battery terminal. I swore under my breath. "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. I told her that it meant that there wasn't a good connection between the battery and the motor, and that the battery was probably dead. We could fix the corrosion, but we need a jump to get the car started again. I talked the problem over with Sarah. We were already dozens of miles from her parents' place, and we had no signal. Based on the car wreck, it was likely we wouldn't see any more traffic for hours at best and days at worst. On top of all that, the sun was starting to get low in the sky. We needed to find someone with jumper cables. I remember that we'd passed a house a few miles back on the road. I figured it'd be best if Sarah stayed with our car on the side of the road, so I started walking back up the road by myself. It took me a little more than an hour of walking before I saw the house again. I'll show a picture of it here. The house had a strange architecture, with part of the top floor hanging over the lower floor. I saw there was a small garage in the woods behind the house. I walked up to the door and knocked, calling out as I did. There was no answer. I went to the window next to the door and looked through. I saw that the inside of the house was abandoned, but that there was a message scrawled on the wall. I could just barely make out the words. It said, "They can't see you if you don't make noise." I read it over and over. They can't see you if you don't make noise? What did they mean? I checked my phone again, but still had no signal. I yelled out for help, but heard nothing. Judging by the state of the place, I figured it must have been abandoned. On top of everything else, the sky was starting to get dark. I made my way towards the garage behind the house and kicked in a door. The inside was in fairly good condition still. There was an old cabinet against the wall. I opened it up and saw some rusted jumper cables and a flashlight sitting on a shelf. I figured that the battery in the crashed car we saw might still have enough charge to jump my car, so I grabbed both of them. At this point, it was completely dark outside. I started walking back towards my car and was happy to see that the flashlight still worked. I was alternating between walking fast and flat-out running. Something about the house and the message had given me a bad feeling, and I was eager to get back. I was walking along the road when I heard a scuffling sound out in the woods behind me. I stopped and looked back for a long moment. That's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my flashlight forwards and saw a creature standing behind a tree. It moved its head in erratic motion, constantly twitching. It looked like a gigantic spider with a human head. Its eyes reflected the light of my flashlight like headlights. I heard more motion in the woods behind it. I locked my muscles in place. I gripped my phone hard and accidentally pulled the volume button, which I have set to take a picture on my phone's camera. My phone took a picture, making the loud clicking camera noise. At the sound, the creature snapped its head in my direction and began moving around the tree. Here's the picture that I took. I pulled back my arm and threw my flashlight as hard as I could behind me on the road. The creature looked over my shoulder and with its spindle legs started walking towards the flashlight. I noted that it moved pretty slow. The moments it took to walk by me were an eternity. When I saw it was a dozen yards away, I started running down the road and didn't look back. After an eternity of running, I reached my car, completely out of breath and full of adrenaline. Sarah opened her door and got out. "Hey, you find any help?" she asked. I yelled for her to stay in the car and ran up to the crashed one. I reached my hand into the broken window and popped its hood, then ran around and pulled its battery out. I attached the cables I'd brought to both batteries, and Sarah turned over our car's engine. I ripped the cables off of our battery and slammed the hood shut, then jumped into the driver's seat and sped down the road. Once we made it home, I told Sarah about what happened. She started bawling and told me that she'd heard stories while growing up about the valley that we'd been in, and that it was the reason she was hesitant earlier. She never imagined that there was actually anything to them. I don't know what to think now. If I find anything else, I'll be sure to update you all here.
Story number 3. Something lives in the woods in Washington State. I'd been going to college here in Washington State for 2 full semesters before I finally decided to join a fraternity. I'm not a party animal or anything, but the stories I'd heard about a particular fraternity's parties were enough to convince me that I had to do whatever it took to join it. Initiation week was exactly what you'd expect. They made us stay up for several nights in a row, eat some raw sardines, stuff like that. The crowning moment of the initiation process was that each person had to spend a night in the so-called murder forest just outside the city. Now, this forest is famous in our area for being haunted. Apparently, several serial killer victims were found there, and on top of that, people hear weird sounds sometimes. Still, I thought, lots of places have local legends, and I figured that the stories had been exaggerated to enhance our hazing experience. So, the 6 other initiates and I hopped into vans and were driven to the edge of the forest. One of the older members told us we should walk for about an hour along a path, and that we'd find a campsite where we could spend the night. Each of us was carrying a backpack with a sleeping bag and a tarp that we could lay on top of. I had been walking with the other guys in the group for 45 minutes when an idea crossed my mind. The rules we'd been given said we had to spend the night in the forest, not that we had to spend it in a particular area. They wanted us at that campsite so they could come in during the night and mess with us. I had no doubt. So, I decided to set off into the woods by myself to avoid the hassle that sleeping in the designated campsite would bring. I congratulated myself on my smarts, thinking I had avoided any trouble. I was wrong. I walked for another 15 minutes or so by myself, lighting my way with a flashlight. I recorded some footage of me walking through the forest, which you've been seeing. I found a nice secluded spot with a clearing. I looked around and saw it was completely empty, so I set up my tarp and laid out my sleeping bag. The forest was alive with the sound of crickets, birds, and wind. I lay down in my sleeping bag feeling satisfied and flipped off the light. The forest fell silent. I don't mean to say that the wind lulled or that there was a momentary lapse in crickets. I mean that everything that could make a sound stopped making noise all at once. It was so sudden and so complete that I thought I had gone deaf. I pulled my hand up to my ears, but when I rubbed my fingers together, the soft rustling sounded out like normal. I looked around in the pitch darkness, but a thick layer of clouds made the night nearly absolutely dark. I was fumbling for my flashlight when I felt it. A warm, humid breath spread across the back of my neck, like a person was standing 6 inches behind me, blowing slowly. It stood in stark contrast to the chilly early spring air that I had been feeling up till then. My hand found the flashlight, and I spun it around, illuminating the clearing behind me, revealing nothing but grass and trees. The instant my light turned on, the sound returned to the forest, crickets and cicadas chirping away softly. I started to stand up to leave, but stopped myself. I had to have been psyching myself out. All of the stories from the frat brothers must have just been getting to my head. I couldn't explain the silence, but I resolved to stay the night. I laid back down with the light, and finally convinced myself to turn it back off. I half expected the forest sound to go with it, but thankfully, the crickets and the wind stayed constant. I laid in the darkness for a while, trying to relax my heart rate enough to fall asleep. After what must have been half an hour, I finally drifted off. I don't know how much time passed, but I was woken up by a new sound. It was the sound of rhythmic, heavy breathing, occasionally broken up by mumbling. The sound was coming from in front of my sleeping bag and high above me, probably some 30 feet away. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app. I took a picture with the flash to light up the clearing and saw a figure in the trees staring down at me. It was a woman wearing a long white dress. She had long black hair that covered her face. And her face, it looked like the skin had worn through in places. She was staring down at me. The image from the flash was burned into my mind. I kicked out of my sleeping bag and started running away through the forest in my bare feet. I couldn't hear motion behind me, but I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest where I got cell service. Here's the picture that I took of the woman. After I got back, I grilled the members of the fraternity, but each of them swore that they had nothing to do with it. I had been right about them scaring the other members of the group, but they had just used air horns and guns firing blanks to scare them while they slept. I guess it's possible that they were behind it all, but I can't see how they could have made the forest silent or breathed on the back of my neck when not even the other initiates knew where I was. And that woman was not something fraternity members could have created. If I find anything else out, I'll let you know. Story number 4. When I said I wanted to be a nature photographer, this isn't what I had in mind.
Something terrible happened over the last weekend. People died. I'm going over the journal entries I took over those few days to try and think through what happened. Journal entry number 1, Friday, 11:45 p.m. Tony finally got permission from his parents to organize a trip out here. Earlier this week, I'd finished my class when he ran up to me all out of breath. "Dude, they finally said we could use it," he said excitedly. Tony's parents own this amazing $1 million cabin located deep in the forest here in Washington State. I'd been hoping for the chance to stay there again ever since I'd first visited back when Tony and I were in middle school together. For an aspiring nature photographer like myself, access to a pristine cabin in an untouched forest is a chance that I couldn't pass up. There's opportunities for some nature shots that would make Planet Earth viewers jealous. "That's sick," I said. "So this weekend then? Who should we invite?" "I'll bring Amy, and we should probably invite Beth." I grit my teeth. "If we invite Beth, we'll have to invite Trish, you know. And Beth will want to bring that weird guy she's been dating too." Tony rolled his eyes. "Come on, James. Hasn't it been like 2 whole months since you and Trish broke up? It'll be fine." I conceded the point. When Tony gets an idea in his head, there's not much use trying to change it. Me, Tony, and the rest of our friends set off for the cabin earlier this afternoon. We decided to take Beth's truck because the road to Tony's cabin turns to dirt as you approach, and it just made sense to take a 4-wheel drive. Beth's truck is a 6-seater, but even so, by the end of the 3-hour drive, all 6 of us were cramped and happy to stretch our legs. The cabin and woods were as incredible as I remembered. I mean, look at this place. We all grabbed our stuff from the back of the truck and shuffled towards our rooms. The cabin was big enough for the couples to share rooms and for Trish to get her own, leaving me on the couch in the living room. I was throwing my pillow and blankets on the couch when I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. "Hey, James," a girl's voice said. "That couch gonna be enough for you?" I turned around and saw Trish leaning against the banister. "Oh yeah," I said. "Honestly, it's probably going to be more comfortable than my crappy dorm room bed." "That's good," she said. An awkward silence passed between us. "It's good to see you." "It's good to see you too," I said. I was surprised to find it was true. Trish looked down at her hands and wrung them in silence. "Would you mind if I asked you a question?" I nodded and she continued. Why'd you stop talking to me? After everything that happened, I mean," she asked quietly. I grimaced and rubbed my forehead. "I don't know, Trish. It just felt awkward, I guess. It wasn't anything personal." She nodded, and we passed another long, awkward moment in silence. "Well, this weekend should be awesome," she said. "I know you're always looking for photo opportunities." With that, she turned and headed back up the stairs. The sun soon set, and we all headed outside to the fire pit. Beth was slowly working through an entire book of matches, lighting one after another underneath a thick pile of sticks. "Come on, you stupid thing," she muttered under her breath. Amy, Tony's girlfriend, approached the pit. "You mind if I give it a try?" she asked. "Please," Beth said, gesturing towards the fire. Amy stripped some fluffy bark from a few sticks, lit a single match, and blew into the smoldering tinder. Soon there was a blazing fire in the pit. Beth bowed herself to the ground. "Teach me your ways, master," she said. We all laughed at that, and Amy tapped a green tattoo on the inside of her ankle. It was a logo of the Girl Scouts. "I've spent my share of time in the outdoors," she said. "I liked it so much I decided to get this tat." She laughed and walked back to the log where Tony sat and leaned against him. "I swear, some guys just get all the luck. He's got money, looks, and a girl." I fought the urge to look over at Trish. The universe just isn't fair. Beth had invited this new guy named Connor that she's been dating. They've only been together for a week or two, but I guess that means you get an invite to this sort of thing. He was staring at the fire, slowly breaking small twigs in his hands. Trish sat across from me, and we both made concerted efforts to pay attention to anything but each other. It was getting to be late fall, so we all crowded close around the campfire to block the chill wind that blew through the trees. The moment was perfect. Perfect, that is, until Connor started talking. Trish had been telling some funny story about her professor when Connor interrupted her. "Have any of you heard about the murders that happened in these woods?" he asked. We paused and told him to stop playing, but there was something in his voice that carried a seriousness that I didn't expect. "I'm not kidding," Connor said. "You can look it up. There's more deaths due to animal attacks in these woods every month than most states get in a year." He spoke with a kind of sing-song indifference, as if he couldn't care less about it. We all sat in silence at that, but Beth finally spoke up. "Don't worry, Connor. I'll tackle any bear that comes close to you." We all smiled at that. That is, all of us except for Connor. He was just staring into the fire, his eyes half narrowed. I didn't know what to make of him and made eye contact with Tony. I made an expression as if to say, "What is it with this dude?" Anyway, we all headed inside soon after that. I laid out on the couch and grabbed my laptop where I'm typing all this now. I hope tomorrow I can get some good photos. I hope things are better with Trish, too. Entry number 2, Saturday, 11:15 p.m. Today was horrible. I'm gonna write down everything I remember. I'm probably gonna need it in court soon. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the front door banging loudly. I got to my feet to check what was up, but by the time I got there, the door was closed. I opened it up and called outside, but heard nothing. I went back to bed, but Connor's words were glowing like coals in the back of my mind. I made sure to lock the door before I went back to the couch. I woke up the next morning and sat up groggily. Trish was in the kitchen cooking some breakfast. She noticed me and shot me an amused smile. "You sleep well?" she asked. "Not really," I said. "Last night I woke up from the front door banging. It was hard to get back to sleep after hearing Connor go off about these woods." Trish nodded. "I know, right? So weird. Why would the door be banging, though?" I shrugged. "Wind, maybe? I'll go take a look." We walked to the front door and I pushed it open. It was heavy, way too heavy for the wind to make that noise. We'd both stepped outside when I noticed them. Multiple deer carcasses were strewn around the ground, some missing limbs, but all covered in deep cuts and torn flesh. "What the?" Trish said under her breath. We heard thunder rumble from the clearing, and I slammed the door shut. "That's not normal," I said. "How many were there?" "I don't know, 6 or 7, she said. The thunder rumbled again, and I heard the sound of rain starting to fall. "Great, and now it's raining on top of everything," I said quietly. We sat down and thought for a long moment. I heard a bedroom door open, and Tony came down the stairs, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on, guys?" he asked. "There are a bunch of deer carcasses covering the ground in front of the cabin," Trish said. He looked at us dumbly. "What?" We were about to show him when we heard a loud knock on the front door. I gave it a long look, but before I could do anything, Tony looked through the peephole. "It's Connor," he said. He opened up the door and Connor stepped into the living room, soaking wet. He shot us all a smile. "Connor," I said, "what were you doing out there? What's going on?" "What do you mean?" he asked. "I was going for a walk." What's the deal with the deer bodies out there?" He cocked his head at us. "What deer bodies?" We opened the door back up and saw that, where each carcass had been, there was little more than a depression in the ground. We would have looked for longer, but the rain was coming down hard, and lightning struck nearby. I didn't know what to think about what happened. In the 2 minutes between us seeing the deer and Connor showing up, someone or something had moved a good 600 pounds of deer. The 4 of us sat in the living room, not saying much. I turned to Tony. "Do we have any way to check the weather?" I asked. "I don't get service out here, and this storm looks like it might get pretty gnarly." "Yeah, I think so," Tony said. "My parents have a computer that should be able to get dial-up through the landline." He walked into a side room with an older computer that whirred to life. He typed on it for a while, then walked back into the room. "It's not connecting," he said. I walked to the landline and picked it up. "No dial tone," I said. Tony's brow furrowed. He took the phone from me and shouted, "That's ridiculous. I called my parents from this phone when we got here yesterday." He held the phone up to his ear, then hung up. He looked at me with a confused look. "But how?" Amy came walking down the stairs, her hair wrapped in a towel from a shower. "What's going on, guys?" I heard shouting. We told her what we'd seen. By the time we were done, she was looking around. "Where's Beth?" We turned to look at Connor. "She was asleep when I left for my walk this morning," he said. We all walked up the stairs to her bedroom and pulled open the door. She was laying on her front, her head and body covered in deep scratches and cuts. Blood was pooled on the bed, still dripping wet from her fingers in a staccato rhythm. Trish screamed and ran in. She shouted her name, shook her, but she was gone. Connor stared from the hallway with a look of shock, not moving. Thunder shook the house, and the rain lashed against the windows. I ran in after Trish and pulled her off Beth, telling her it was too late. We all moved back to the living room, and Trish sat in shock, covered in Beth's blood. I'm sure I was quite a sight as well. I looked at Amy and Connor. "Will you two stay with Trish here? Tony, let's go take another look." Amy nodded and murmured something in Trish's ear. Tony and I walked into Beth's room. The only entrances were the door and a small window that was locked shut from the inside. Tony grabbed my arm. The only way someone got into this room was through that door. It had to be Connor. He killed Beth, and he probably killed those deer you and Trish saw earlier. I nodded. "We need to get back to the city. We should play it cool until then." Tony covered his face with his hands. "Oh man, poor Beth. Why'd—" "Tony, we need to make sure she gets justice. For now, we need to get back," I said. We made our way back to the living room, and I kept Connor in my sights, looking him over. He was clean, not a drop of blood on him, nor did he show any new wounds or signs of a struggle. The rain coming down outside was like something out of a Bible story. I'd never seen so much at once. The wind rushing from the storm was enough to set the entire cabin's frame creaking, and the lightning was close enough to be indistinguishable from its thunder. I sat down next to Trish and held her. She leaned into me, sobbing violently. I leaned and whispered into her ear, "Listen to me, Trish. We need to keep a close eye on Connor. I need your help with that." Trish stiffened and shot a look at me. She rubbed her eyes and nodded slightly. We grabbed our things and prepared to run out of the house for the truck. I held onto Trish's hand and pushed open the heavy front door. As soon as we cleared the doorway, it was a struggle just to keep on our feet. Rain was whipping sideways into my eyes, and I lost my footing several times. Visibility was no more than a few feet in any direction, and branches were being whipped across our path. The only things that I knew were that Trish's hand was in mine, and that the blinking lights from Beth's truck were ahead of us. We finally reached the truck. I jumped into the driver's seat and pulled Trish in after me, slamming the door shut behind us. The moments passed excruciatingly slow, and we kept scanning the windshield for signs of movement, but there was none to be seen. "Now what?" Trish asked. "I don't know. Did they get lost?" I asked, knowing that if I was able to see the blinking hazard lights from the cabin, so could Tony and Amy. "I guess we just need to go back for them," Trish said wearily. The water dripping from her shirt was stained a light red and made stains on the upholstery as it dripped. "I guess we do," I said. We pushed open the driver door and ran back into the tempest. Halfway towards where I hoped the cabin was, I saw Tony laying on the ground with blood streaming from a head wound. Amy and Connor were nowhere to be seen. We half-carried, half-dragged Tony back into the cabin. Inside, the power was out. We cleaned his wounds, and he woke up with a start after a few minutes. "What's going on? Where's Amy?" he asked. "We found you on the ground unconscious," Trish said. "I was running with Amy when—" He rubbed his head. Connor must have knocked me out with something." He looked at me in horror. "He's got Amy." Tony shot to his feet and walked to a cabinet. He pulled out a bolt-action rifle and several rounds of ammunition. I'll kill him, he shouted as he loaded the gun. "Let's just wait for the storm to calm a little bit, and then we'll go looking for him, okay?" I said. "Screw that idea. If he's out there and he has Amy, he's gonna kill her." I figured he had a point, so the three of us walked back into the storm to look for them. It had died down considerably in the hour since we tried leaving, so the rain was merely a downpour instead of being absolutely blinding. We looked for 3 hours, walking up and down the road and all around the house. We couldn't see any sign of them. We were well into the 4th hour when I finally grabbed Tony's shoulder. "Dude, let's just get the cops and get them to come here and help us look." He worked his jaw, not saying anything. "Fine," he said finally. The three of us walked back to the truck, but as I approached, I noticed something wrong. Each of the 4 tires was slashed. Not cleanly, like with a knife, no. Each tire was slashed with what looked like a claw, 4 long marks marring each of the tires. Trish ran her hand along the slashes in the rubber. They seem almost animalistic, like a bear did this, or something. We decided to head back to the house. None of us wanted to make that trip in the rain on foot with whatever this thing was that was stalking us. The three of us are staying in the living room tonight, hoping that tomorrow is clear. Tony has the first watch, though I doubt any of us will get much sleep tonight. I'm sitting on the couch typing this out for the record. I'll let you all know what happens tomorrow. Entry 3, Sunday, 6 p.m. It came into the house around 4 a.m. I was sitting on the couch holding Trish as she leant against me dozing. The storm had blown over, so the sound of shattering glass near the front of the house was so loud it may as well have been like a cannon. I grabbed at the rifle and pointed it towards the door, just in time to see a brown blur streak into the kitchen. It looked like a bear, but it had human proportions and ran on 2 feet like an Olympic sprinter. It ran towards the living room, and I took a shot at it with the rifle. Purely by luck, I managed to hit it. I saw it stagger and fall, and I clumsily re-racked another round in the chamber. I raised the gun again and fired, this time missing terribly. The creature turned around and ran back out the way it came, jumping through the window. The three of us stayed awake until morning. Trish spoke softly as the sun rose. "We have to find another place with a landline. Call help." "And risk meeting that thing where it can attack us from any angle?" Tony asked, his voice shrill. "Tony, she is right," I said. "Anything's better than another night with that thing coming after us." Tony had the most experience with the rifle, so he led the way with it down the path. Trish and I held pool cues and knives for all the good they'd do. Luckily, they weren't needed. Not 5 minutes down the road, we saw the creature again. It was dead and lay on its side just off the road. I took a picture of it, which you can see here. We looked it over, and I noticed something green near its ankle. I stepped closer and saw it was tattooed. It was tattooed with the logo of the Girl Scouts. My mind flashed back to the day before. Amy upstairs alone with Beth. Her walking downstairs all wet from what I thought was just a shower while the rain was pouring outside. Was this? I don't know what to think. The police are looking the area over right now. They think they found Connor's body in a few different places. Amy's is still nowhere to be seen. If anyone has any experience with this, please let me know.
If you've watched to this point, please leave a like on the video to let me know. Subscribe below for more videos every week. An absolutely massive shout out to Melissa Priolo for supporting me on Patreon. Your support is what makes these videos possible, and I really appreciate it. If any of you have the means and the desire to support my stories, my Patreon is linked in the description below. My goal is to be able to support myself writing these stories, and if I reach a certain level on Patreon, I'd be able to quit my job and focus into this full time. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed your time on Worchester Street.